the whole question of Obama and McCain and so forth afterwards. But I thought I would just get things going here by talking about anti-Americanism, the history of anti-Americanism in Europe, and just make some basic points here about what it is we're dealing with when we talk about European anti-Americanism. And one thing that is a running theme in European anti-Americanism is the idea that, well, we loved America before, but now we have a problem with America because of this, that, or the other thing. And the Norwegian writer Jens Bjørneboe wrote an essay in 1966 that's very famous, at least in Norway, called Vi som elsket Amerika. And the reason why he supposedly didn't love America anymore at that time, in 1966, was because of the Vietnam War. And recently, a couple of years ago, during the Iraq War, one of the Norwegian newspapers borrowed his title for an article about how we in Norway don't love America anymore because of the Iraq War. And so there's always been this imaginary past time when everybody in Europe loved America. And in fact, this is not true. It wasn't even true for Jens Bjørneboe, because back in 1952, 14 years before he wrote Vi som elsket Amerika, he had written an essay called Flykten for Amerika I oss, which was, if anything, even more extreme in its anti-Americanism. So this is one important point, that European anti-Americanism is not some recent phenomenon. It can't be explained by a distaste for Bush or for the war in Iraq or concerns about Guantanamo or Abu Ghraib, but it's a very old European tradition that dates back, in fact, to anti-democratic snobbery and condescension. Back in the Bertrand Russell in 1951 called the U.S. a police state, comparing it to Nazi Germany and Stalin's Russia, and of course you could come up with thousands of examples of this. Now, since European writers and intellectuals couldn't deny the reality of American material comforts and American technological conveniences, and this is something that's been true for all the way along, they found it useful to pretend that those conveniences and comforts were all that America was. America, they argued, was intellectually, culturally, emotionally, and spiritually barren. Jean Baudrillard in 1987 wrote that, well, perhaps Americans have no identity, but they have beautiful teeth. This teeth thing comes up a lot for some reason. A classic example of this approach can be found in Bjørneboe's 52 essay, Flykten for Amerika I oss, in which he wrote that America, in place of the soul, has refrigerators and illustrated magazines, canned pineapple, super red apples, canned tomato juice, and synthetic vitamins. America's lack of a sense of higher meaning, he complained, is robbing Europe of its Christian heritage of belief in human brotherhood. America, he wrote, brings with it, quote, an attitude which impoverishes life and makes death meaningless. And what afflicts America, he said, is something quite different from a simple lack of culture. It is a sickness. And the nature of this sickness, he wrote, is this. While Europeans during World War II ate sardines with heads and intestines and tail fins and learned from this deprivation that the point of life is not to enrich oneself materially, but to live in Christian brotherhood with one's fellow man, to be a human being among human beings, Americans only bring the extinction of brotherhood, Christianity's complete eradication from the earth. Bjørneboe had been in the United States once when he was 16. Many years before he wrote that. He wrote that in 1952 in Norway. In other words, 7 years after the war, after the Holocaust, after the liberation of Europe, and in the midst of the Marshall Plan. And he was looking at native-born pathologies that had almost destroyed the continent, almost wiped out the Jews. And he blamed them all on America, which had rescued the continent from its horror and was paying to put it back together again. Bjørneboe was correct to recognize that Europe was experiencing the early stages of a cultural crisis. But he didn't dare face up to the real reason for it, because that would have meant taking a much too unsettling look in the mirror. It was easier to look across the ocean and sneer. The reduction of Americans to their material goods and technological achievements, and the argument that America's material well-being and technological efficiency makes Americans soulless, has been a red thread throughout European commentary on America. To look back in history is to find an amusing pattern. One generation of European intellectuals sneers like Björneboe at this or that recent advance in American material comforts and household conveniences, and a quarter century later, the next generation of European intellectuals takes those same comforts and conveniences for granted as part of everyday life, doesn't identify them at all in America, and meanwhile sneers at the latest American advances of their own day. Well, I have a little more, but should we move on?
I think we're just about done, aren't we?
Yeah, yeah, let's just...
You have more to say.
We can get to see some of these other points
okay,
later.
Fine. Yeah.
Do that way?
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you.
And now if I may introduce our next speaker, Mr. Broder, Henryk Broder from Germany.
And I really have to thank you for giving me the chance to write the foreword for this great book. I read after it appeared, and I couldn't imagine of writing the preface for the Danish or any other edition. So the honor is entirely on my side. Thank you so much for agreeing on the lingua franca being English today. I can't, unfortunately, offer you any other option except for Polish and German. But I think English is quite more accepted than Polish or German, for good reasons. Basically, everything that is important was already said by Bruce, so let me only add some minor points to it. You know, it was just mentioned, I'm coming from Germany, and I have this tie on purpose today. I am going to appear today on TV tie. So I take all the chances when I appear on TV, what happens from time to time, to have a pro-American button, to have this tie. And then, you know, I go home around midnight, I open my computer, and there are hundreds of emails telling me I am a traitor. Not because of what I have said, or maybe I did not say, or because I forgot to say, because it's already too late, because of the tie. And that's enough to provoke, you know, a storm, a tempest in a water cup. And by the way, this is something I also do enjoy very much. Anti-Americanism was now described by Bruce, and I think there is very little to say beyond these limits, but nevertheless, anti-Americanism is today the glue that keeps the progressive elements of society together. Let's say you're going to a party with nice people that were described by Bruce, intellectuals, writers, members of the political elite, the chattering classes, and if you want to score some points, you're only supposed to say, wir wollen keine amerikanischen Verhältnisse. Okay, some of you understand German. So we do not want to live in under American conditions. People can't define what is American conditions, but it's enough to say this phrase, you know, to throw it on the table, and all of the people who get the phrase, they agree. And then I ask, you know what is American conditions? Maybe division of power, checks and balances, also some good way of corrupt society with welfare. It's not bad. No, they don't know what American conditions are, but they reject the notion of living under American conditions. So it's a kind of common denominator. But it's not an it's not an honest attitude. It's masquerading itself as critique. And of course, critique is a legitimate thing, even if it's not justified. You cannot prevent anyone from criticizing anything. And so the most common sentence I always get to hear when I intervene in that kind of discussions is, millions of Americans are criticizing America and I am not allowed to do it? They don't realize that millions of Americans do have different motives and different reasons to criticize America, and there's different motives and reasons, and not the motives and reasons for the average German to criticize America. It's very, very hard to comprehend. But in any case, you know, when Norman Chomsky or Norman Finkelstein or Gore Vidal is criticizing America, the average German writer or poet or someone living on unemployment payment because he's got no time for work, because he's got to change the society. So he can take Mr. Gore Vidal as an alibi for his own endeavors. There are two things I would like to say. You have to understand, really, it sounds very arrogant, but it's unfortunately true. You have to understand when dealing and coping with Germany today. First of all, Germany is a real democratic society, you know, and all the anxieties and the fears of the Nazis coming back, this is bullshit. And unfortunately, all this bullshit is produced and performed by German leftists, who see now the chance to do something their parents didn't do in the 30s and the 40s. We call it nachgeholter Widerstand. And it's very effective, and it's very productive, and it's very successful. At least it's producing dozens of books every year, how to fight Nazism today. So forget this notion, it's a democratic society, and you cannot complain about a lack of democracy. But there are two basic things you have to understand. One basic thing is there is a very strange, sick, sadomasochistic relation now between Jews and Germans, or German and Jews. And to understand this relation, you have simply to accept one sentence that was coined by an Israeli psychoanalyst. His name is Sfirex. He died many years ago. He coined one great sentence saying, "The Germans will never forgive the Jews for Auschwitz." And while the Jews, meanwhile, forgave the Germans for Auschwitz, it works the other way around. The Germans are not going to forgive us for Auschwitz. I can elaborate on this, but please take it so far. The second sentence you have really to accept, believe me, you have to trust me a little bit. The Germans will never forgive the Americans for saving them from the Nazis. It's a deep insult, you know, for a German Studienrat who grew up with Schiller and Goethe and Hölderlin and Kant and Hegel and all the saints of German philosophical history. It's a deep insult for the Studienrat that his father or even himself was liberated by a black American chewing gum and having no idea of German culture. And this is a very deep insult. It's still active and it's still expressing itself today. So this is the mental frame you have to take into account when you are discussing the German Massenpsychology. And there are two things that you have to distinguish. One is prejudice and resentment. I am a great follower, a great admirer of prejudice. You need prejudice. Without prejudice, there is no orientation in life. And prejudice may not be nice, but it's not too dangerous, because in this kind of society we have now, it doesn't do any harm to anyone. Every person has its own set of prejudice. It's a different thing with resentments. You know, resentment is a really dangerous thing, and because we don't resent people for what they do, but we resent people for what they are. So while critic and also prejudice is directed against attitudes, resentment is directed against the very existence of a person or a society. A very good example for resentment is, of course, anti-Semitism. Jews were blamed for being rich and being poor. They were being blamed for being socialist, and they were being blamed for being capitalist. And whatever they did was the wrong thing, and it was the right thing to provoke the anti-Semites. So they had simply no option. There was no way to do something the right way. Even the opposite thing they did was held against them. So resentment, again, is directed against the very existence of a person, and this is the fact with anti-Americanism. If you want to escape the injustice of prejudice, you can simply change your behavior. But you cannot change your existence to accommodate the mental anger, the mental fire of someone who is ridden with resentments. I want to give you one or two examples, and then we can start the discussion if it's okay with you. Of course, resentment is totally immune against facts. If you tell the people what the Americans have been doing to spread democracy, so they will tell you this may be so, but they had already their own business in mind. And so it's a futile, useless exercise to fight against resentments. I found some, I tried to find out, because I knew what we were going to say, when anti-Americanism has, where are the roots of anti-Americanism in German history. And the first guy, he may not be the first, but at least he is the first on record, the first guy who expressed his anti-American attitudes very openly and clearly was a very famous poet, ein Romantiker, Nikolaus Lehmann. In 1830, he went to America. He went to America. He was Austrian, but he grew up in the southern part of Germany. And Nikolaus Lehmann went to America in 1830. It was a great adventure to go to America. It's not just hoping on going on a plane and landing in Newark or New Jersey. And he was terribly disappointed. And he wrote about America exactly what you can read today, only in a little different way. So let me give you two quotes. I will do it in German, someone can translate it, because it's so beautiful, and you see, nothing has changed since then. Der Amerikaner hat keinen Wein, keine Nachtigall. Mag er bei einem Glase Cider seine Spottdrossel behorchen, mit seinen Dollars in der Tasche, ich setze mich lieber zum Deutschen und höre bei seinem Wein die liebe Nachtigall, wenn auch die Tasche ärmer ist. You have all the elements again. The American who is buying and doing everything with his dollars, but has no culture, because not even the nightingale is willing to sing for the American. And another quote also by Nikolaus Lehmann. This is my favorite quote, again dealing with the Nachtigall. Obviously he was obsessed with nachtigalls. Nightingales. People like you and me are obsessed with two things, food and sex. He was obsessed with nightingales. Hier gibt es keine Nachtigall, überhaupt keine wahren Sangvögel. Und dies scheint mir ein poetischer Fluch zu sein, a poetic curse, der auf dem Lande liegt und von tiefer Bedeutung. So it's obviously self-inflicted. Now this was Nikolaus Lehmann, almost 200 years ago, and we have the same examples that are very recent. By the way, Nikolaus Lehmann is one of the favorite poets of Günter Grass, and I think he's someone I don't have to introduce to you today. Günter Grass. And there was another quite famous German writer who died a couple of years ago, and by now he's almost forgotten. It was Reinhard Lettau. He was a German with an American passport, or the other way around. Anyway, he was of German origin. And Reinhard Lettau got a grant, I think, from the Ford Foundation, and he went to Berkeley for a year or two in the 60s, 50 years ago. And when he came back, he wrote a book about America. The title of the book was Täglicher Faschismus, Daily Fascism. Daily Fascism. Wow. 20 years after the collapse of German fascism, a German writer discovers daily fascism in the US. What was he writing about? He was not writing mainly about political life or parties or corrupt governments. He was writing about daily events like police brutality and impolite behavior of public servants toward the population. Things that happen all over the world. They happen in Germany, maybe on a lesser scale in Denmark, but it's nothing that justifies the term fascism. It may justify the term bad behavior, bad manners, bad government, but not fascism. But for Reinhard Lettau, it was the incorporation of fascism, and so in that way, something started that is still prevailing today. The term fascism was shifted from Europe to America. And who is now, someone who now is behaving as an anti-American, in an anti-American way, can justify his behavior by saying that he is fighting fascism. And this is a very strange situation that was also described by Bruce. So far, thank you.